Today, we'll explore a pretty fundamental topic: religion. At its core, religion tends to divide people into groups: those who believe and those who don't, the enlightened and the not so enlightened. But ironically, that dividing line has also made religion one of the most powerful forces for building community. People often rally together around shared beliefs, shared traditions, and yes, shared boundaries that keep the other out. Unlike race or gender, religion is something people can, at least in theory, choose. That adds another layer of complexity. Globally, the vast majority of people, about 84%, identify with some kind of religion. We're talking over 2 billion Christians, 1.6 billion Muslims, and significant numbers of Hindus, Buddhists, and others. Then there's a growing group, about 1.1 billion people, who don't identify with any religion at all, though many still have spiritual beliefs. What's interesting is how geography plays into this. Most religious groups are heavily concentrated in certain parts of the world. For example, Asia Pacific is home to a huge proportion of the world's religious population. So when we talk about immigration and diversity in countries like Canada, we're talking about people bringing deeply rooted religious traditions with them. Now, this is where things get a little tense. In Canada, we like to think of ourselves as multicultural, and for the most part, people are on board with that. But when it comes to religion, especially when religious practices seem to bump up against Canadian laws or values, that's often where the support gets shaky. A lot of Canadians are okay with different foods, different holidays, maybe even traditional clothing, but when they hear about religious accommodations at work, in schools, or in courtrooms, the tone changes. Add in news about terrorism or religious abuse scandals here or abroad, and suddenly religion becomes a hot button issue in public life. Some Canadians will tell you that religious freedom is guaranteed in the Constitution. Others throw around the phrase separation of church and state, assuming we're like the US. But Canada's history is different. Our approach to religion has developed along its own path: different laws, different court decisions, and different debates. So the big question becomes, can Canada continue to be united when people are holding on to such different and sometimes conflicting beliefs? That's what makes religion such an important and challenging part of the multiculturalism conversation. Before we get into the tricky questions about religious accommodation, like what obligations employers or public institutions might have to respect people's faith-based needs, it's important to look at the bigger picture of religious affiliation in Canada. Who believes what, and how is that changing? Christianity still dominates Canada's religious landscape. As of the 2011 National Household Survey, it accounted for about 76% of the population, and nearly 48% of recent immigrants identified as Christian too. Roman Catholicism is the largest denomination, making up around 43% of Canadians. That's partly due to its long-standing presence in Canada, especially in Quebec. Protestant churches, once the largest, now make up about 27%. But things are changing. Back in 1851, Catholics and Protestants together made up 98% of the population. Even in 1951, they accounted for 96%. So 70% today may still sound like a lot, but it's a steep decline from previous generations. Now let's talk about the fastest growing group: people who claim no religion at all. By 2011, nearly 24% of Canadians identified with no religion, and that included around 20% of recent immigrants. This trend is especially visible among younger Canadians. In 1991, 94% of people over 65 had some religious affiliation. But among those aged 15 to 44, that number dropped to 86%, and it's continuing to fall. Younger people are much more likely to identify with no religion or with Eastern faiths like Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. Speaking of growth, let's talk about the influence of immigration. Between 1991 and 2001, the Muslim population in Canada doubled from about 250,000 to over 500,000. By 2011, it reached 3.2% of the population, and projections suggest that by 2030, it'll more than double again. Similar trends show up in other religious groups. Hindus now make up 1.5%, Sikhs 1.4%, and Buddhists 1.1%. What's driving this change? It's not just where people are immigrating from, it's also age and birth rate. The median age of Anglicans, for instance, is much older than that of Muslims or Sikhs. In 2001, the average age for Muslims in Canada was just 28. For Sikhs and Hindus, it was 30 and 32. These younger populations mean not just growth now, but more growth in the years ahead. And we can't forget about the Orthodox Christian and Jewish communities. Orthodox denominations, Greek, Ukrainian, Russian, and Serbian, added up to about 500,000 people in 2001, with Russian and Serbian churches seeing notable increases. The Jewish population has remained steady at about 1% of the population, with most adherents living in Ontario. But while immigration is bringing new energy to religious communities, mainstream Christian churches are struggling. Declining attendance has led to churches closing across the country. In fact, the United Church of Canada, the largest Protestant denomination, closes about one church every week. One study warned that at the current rate of decline, there might be only one Anglican church left in the entire country by 2061. You can see this decline physically. In Montreal, a once bustling church with over 1,000 parishioners is now shuttered due to safety hazards. Even a $2.5 million organ from that church couldn't find a new home, even when they tried to give it away. What's interesting is that while these older Christian institutions are fading, recent immigrants tend to maintain regular religious attendance, often as much as Canadians did back in the 1980s. So there's a noticeable contrast. Churches built by earlier generations are closing, while newcomers are keeping faith alive in new ways. Some people frame this as a threat, that immigrant faiths are overtaking Canadian ones. But if we look more closely, the story is more nuanced. It's not religious accommodation that's eroding traditional Christianity in Canada. It's demographic and cultural change. People are choosing differently. And ironically, immigrants arriving with strong religious identities are actually living out one of the most core Canadian values, the right to practice your faith freely in a multicultural society. Let's take a closer look at religious pluralism as part of Canada's legal foundation. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees freedom of religion and conscience, and says the Charter should be interpreted in a way that supports our multicultural heritage. In practice, that means the government has a duty to make room for religious expression, even when it's inconvenient or costly. But things get complicated when one person's rights conflict with another's. The courts have seen many cases like this, some of which we'll look at later. Historically, religion in Canada was about fitting in, not diversity. The French brought Catholicism, the British brought Anglicanism, and as British influence grew, being Christian, specifically Anglican, became a marker of Canadian identity. That mindset was enforced through policies like residential schools, which stripped Indigenous children of their spiritual traditions. Even in the early 1900s, public officials were calling for the Christianization of immigrants as a requirement for becoming Canadian. That kind of thinking was rooted in racism and exclusion, but it shaped the national narrative for a long time. Things began to shift with the Charter in 1982. A key turning point came in 1985 when the Supreme Court struck down the Lord's Day Act, ruling that forcing businesses to close on Sundays for religious reasons violated freedom of religion. Today, those old assumptions are still being challenged. Canada is becoming more religiously diverse, and that's visible in everything from public holidays to city hall decorations. But not everyone is comfortable with these changes. Some worry that accommodating religious diversity threatens Canadian values or social cohesion, especially when it comes to issues like gender equality. So, the challenge we face isn't just legal, it's cultural. How do we protect religious freedom and diversity while still holding on to a shared sense of who we are as a country? So how does Canada actually handle religious accommodation? While big cases go to the Supreme Court, most of the day-to-day work happens through provincial human rights commissions. These bodies handle issues like religious discrimination in workplaces, public services, and housing. The basic rule is this: under provincial human rights codes, it's illegal to discriminate against someone based on their religion, or what's officially called creed. And that definition is intentionally broad. It includes not just mainstream religions, but newer or non-traditional belief systems and even indigenous spiritual practices. You don't have to believe in a god, and you don't need formal membership in an institution. What matters is that the belief is sincerely held. That means if someone follows Falun Gong, which is outlawed in China and often not recognized as a religion, they're still protected under Canadian law. In fact, there was a case in Ottawa where a woman won damages after being discriminated against for practicing Falun Gong at a senior center. But this gets tricky fast. What exactly counts as undue hardship for an employer? There's no fixed dollar amount. It depends on context. An accommodation that works for one employee might be unmanageable with 10 others asking for the same thing. Safety can also be a valid reason to say no. For example, if a religious garment can't be safely worn with a mandatory uniform or protective gear. Employees don't have to prove their beliefs are essential or part of some official doctrine. They just need to show the belief is genuine and consistent with how they live. However, misusing this, for instance, asking for religious time off but using it to work a second job, isn't protected. And to be clear, political views, no matter how passionate, are not covered by religious accommodation laws, nor are practices that break the law, like violence or harmful rituals. Accommodation is about leveling the playing field, not giving one religion an advantage over others. At the same time, hate crimes based on religion are rising. About 29% of all police-reported hate crimes in Canada are motivated by religion. Jewish communities still report the highest number of targeted attacks, but hate crimes against Muslims have risen sharply. This rise in suspicion, especially toward Muslims, has real consequences. Surveys show over half of Canadians express some level of distrust toward Muslims, often blaming Muslims themselves, while admitting that the internet is their top source of that information. And yet, Canadian Muslims report high satisfaction with life here, higher than the national average. That's a pretty telling disconnect. Muslim immigrants often come from countries affected by war or crisis, which means they face additional challenges starting over in Canada. And like many other groups, they often settle in ethnic communities, not out of a desire to isolate, but because it's easier to rebuild when you're surrounded by familiar language, food, and values. Unfortunately, darker-skinned Muslims also face the added burden of racism. Research shows that skin color, not religion, is the biggest barrier to feeling like you belong. So it's not just about Islamophobia. It's about anti-blackness, anti-brownness, and all the ways appearance intersects with religion and identity. Then there are concerns, especially among critics of multiculturalism, about gender equality. Cases like the murder of Aqsa Parvez, a teenager killed in what was labeled an honor killing, have sparked outrage and fear. While such crimes are rare and condemned under both Canadian and Islamic law, they get used as fuel for arguments against Muslim immigration. The takeaway here is this: Canada's legal system protects religious freedom, but it also draws a hard line when that freedom is used as a cover for abuse. The goal is to create a country where diverse beliefs are respected, but not at the cost of human rights or public safety. Finally, let's turn our focus to intersectionality, how religion connects with other identity markers like race and age. It's a complex and important concept that helps explain a lot of what we see in Canadian society today. One of the first big problems that's been flagged is how often we confuse religion with race. When we lump everyone of a certain faith together, like assuming all Muslims are the same regardless of whether they're from Indonesia or Lebanon, we erase important racial and cultural differences. This oversimplification ignores how people's identities are shaped not just by what they believe, but by where they're from and how they're perceived racially. This kind of confusion has real consequences. A stereotype has emerged around what some call the apparent Muslim. Basically, anyone who looks a certain way: brown skin, beard, maybe a turban. The problem here is that this stereotype catches up a whole range of people, many of whom aren't even Muslim, like Sikhs and Hindus, and paints them with the same brush. It's an example of how ignorance and fear can turn into harmful generalizations that fuel hate crimes and xenophobia. But intersectionality doesn't only explain how oppression works, it can also help us understand privilege. For example, someone who is white and Christian in Canada may experience religious privilege, often without realizing it. This shows up in places like national holidays, school calendars, or how mainstream culture talks about religion as if Christianity is just the default. That kind of unspoken norm makes other religions seem foreign or other. And even when we make efforts to be inclusive, there's a risk of tokenism, like treating other faiths as exotic add-ons or casually borrowing indigenous spiritual practices without understanding or respecting them. Age also plays a big role in religious identity. Young Canadians are much more likely to say they have no religion. For example, almost 30% of people born after 1967 report no religious affiliation. That's a big shift compared to older generations where the numbers are much lower. And what's more, disaffiliation increases as people age. So someone who identified as religious in their 30s might no longer do so by the time they're in their 50s or 60s. It's a gradual cultural shift that's changing how religion fits into Canadian life. Finally, when we look at the median age of religious groups, we see differences there too. Faiths like Protestantism, Judaism, and Roman Catholicism have older average followers, while groups like Islam, Sikhism, and Hinduism tend to skew younger. The no religion group is also mostly younger, which tells us that disaffiliation is a trend that's likely to continue. So when we talk about religion in Canada, we're not just talking about belief. We're talking about how that belief intersects with race, age, privilege, and power in ways that shape people's everyday experiences.